What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We did a video on the top 10 non-conference games for 2023. Now we're going to do the top 10 conference games, the games that will determine the conference races, determine who is going to make it into the conference championship games. And again, we're just looking at the Power 5 games here. And this was really tough because there are a lot of really important games, conference games, more than 10, but this was my best shot at giving you the top 10 and ranking them. So let's start at number 10, Week 8, October 21st, Penn State at Ohio State. Obviously going to be a big game in the Big Ten. Is Penn State on that level? Are they ready to knock off Ohio State or Michigan potentially and maybe get into the Big Ten championship? This is probably the least likely win for them. Not saying that Ohio State's a better team than Michigan, but just because this one's on the road. And I'll just go ahead and we'll talk about both of these games together because I'll go to number 9 now. And that's Week 11, November 11th, Michigan at Penn State. So I think this is a little bit of a bigger game because Michigan's going on the road. And this is one that I think Penn State has a better chance of winning. Not saying they can't beat Ohio State. And again, I think Michigan is better than Ohio State. But playing on the road is tough. And this is a tough place to play, obviously. So both of these games are going to be huge in shaping the Big Ten East race. We're talking about playoff implications, all of that. Just two monster games in the Big Ten. And again, going back to number 10 here, Week 8, Penn State at Ohio State. And then you go just a few weeks later, Week 11, Michigan at Penn State. Two big games there. All right, moving on to number 8. It's Week 10, November 4th, Washington at USC. I think these might be the best two teams in the Pac-12, and these two teams could potentially face each other again in the Pac-12 championship. But it's going to, I don't know necessarily that the two best teams are going to play in the Pac-12 championship just because you've got four really good teams. The schedules are going to be, they're going to beat up on each other more than likely. And at the end of the day, we might not even have the two best teams just because of the way the schedules go and everything. But this is just a huge game. And like I said, maybe arguably the top two teams in the Pac-12. Maybe it's the first of two matchups here, and maybe it's not really that big of a game, but you lose this game, and I'm telling you, it's going to be tough to win the rest of your games in the Pac-12. The winner of this one really will be in the driver's seat in that Pac-12 race. Moving on to number 7, Week 7, October 14th, Oregon at Washington. Another huge game in the Pac-12, and a lot of big games in the Pac-12 this year because you've got 4, 5, 6 really good teams in this conference, and it's going to be I would say the Pac-12 is probably going to be the most exciting conference race in college football this year. But yeah, Oregon-Washington, rivalry game, huge game here. Oregon felt like they probably should have won last year, kind of gave the game away late. This time they got to go on the road to face Washington. I'm telling you, if Washington can beat USC and Oregon, they're going to be the Pac-12 championship. I know they also do play Utah, but they're going to be in great shape if they can beat both Oregon and USC. But two very tough games for them. Oregon maybe doesn't have to win this game. Of course, they're going to play USC. I mean, these teams all pretty much play each other. It's going to be a really fascinating race. But this is a big one. Again, rivalry game here in the Pac-12. And we're going to stay in the Pac-12 for number 6. This is Week 9, October 21st, Utah at USC. And so Utah's had USC's number. This is the one team that USC seems to not be able to beat. They get them at home this year. They're going to have a great opportunity. But if they lose again, like I said, you've got those other tough games. You've got Washington. You've got Oregon on the schedule. So many tough games for USC. They need to find a way to beat Utah this year. And again, getting them at home, they've got to win this game if they're going to be in that playoff conversation at the end of the season. Utah can, again, beat them once again, maybe get back to the Pac-12 championship. I don't know that Utah, and I think Utah is right there with USC, Oregon, and Washington, but just the way their schedule falls, I don't know that they're going to be in the playoff conversation at the end of the year. Even if they win this game, maybe if they win this game, they're in there, but this is just, it's going to be a huge game in the Pac-12. And like I said, we've seen some great matchups here, but USC has not been able to beat Utah. Will this be the year that can they finally win a big game here over the Utes? Moving on to number 5, it's the Red River rivalry, Oklahoma, Texas. They'll play Week 6, October 7th. Potentially the first of two matchups here between these two teams. We'll see how this conference race goes. I'll go ahead and say that the winner of this game will be in the Big 12 championship. I believe that. The loser, we'll see what happens. But again, I know Oklahoma wasn't great last year. When you look at their roster and their team, I really feel like these are the two top teams in the Big 12. I know everyone's going to say, well, it's just because of the brands, Texas and Oklahoma. Kansas State's just as good, TCU's just as good, Texas Tech, whatever. But if you really evaluate these rosters, I do believe these are the two best rosters. Oklahoma's got to get some things fixed on defense, but they've got a whole offseason to do that. And I just feel like they're going to be much, much better this year. So I think this is a game that is crucial in the Big 12 race. The winner, like I said, is going to be in the Big 12 championship. The loser, they're going to have a tough road and maybe won't get there. So this potentially could be the first of two matchups, but not necessarily. It's a huge, huge game in the Big 12. Let's go to number 4 now. LSU at Alabama, always a huge game. This year will be no different. This game probably will decide the SEC West. I'm not going to say it will for sure. I think the loser of this game is still going to be alive because of the schedules that these teams play. LSU, let's say they lose this game. It would not shock me to see Alabama lose a couple of other games, or vice versa. If LSU were to upset Alabama, it wouldn't shock me to see LSU lose a couple of other games, although when we're talking about losing 2 conference games outside of this game, maybe not. So that's why I do think this game, at the end of the day, will determine the SEC West, unless, let's say, Texas A&M, they're a lot better than we expect, and they're in that top tier this year, and they kind of live up to that talent, and maybe they're in the race. But otherwise, this game should decide the SEC West. Number 3, this is a game that I think absolutely will decide the SEC East. I don't think there's really any doubt about it. Week 12, November 18th, right at the end of the season, week before rivalry weekend, Georgia at Tennessee. Can the Vols pull off the upset at home? Remember, they upset Alabama last year at home. Can they do it to Georgia this year? If they do, they probably win the SEC East. Not a guarantee. They could have a couple losses before this. They do play Alabama on the road. They do play Texas A&M, so they might wind up with a couple of losses before this game, but there's a really good chance that they've only got one loss going into this game, and this one should determine the SEC East. Georgia's not going to have more than one loss. Maybe someone upsets them. I don't really see that happening. But if they do get upset somewhere, they're not going to have more than one loss. And so this is a game that should determine the SEC East. I would say maybe Kentucky could possibly be in that conversation this year. But they do have to play Alabama out of the West, so I just don't see them being there. And again, I think this is the matchup that will determine the SEC East. Huge game there late in the season. Number 2, back to an earlier week in the season, week 4, September 23rd, Florida State at Clemson. Huge game. And just like with Oklahoma and Texas, the winner of this game, I think they're going to be in the ACC championship. The loser, there's no guarantee. Now, I do think these are clearly the top 2 teams in the conference, but I could also see a team like North Carolina sneak in there with just one loss, or maybe a Miami or a Louisville sneaks up and is a lot better than we think. Maybe even Duke can get in the conversation. So I think the loser of this game has a really good shot, and we could see a rematch in the ACC championship. But I also think the loser of this game, there's no room for error, and they could potentially lose another game and not make it to the ACC championship. So this is a huge game in that conference. Like I said, winner, they're going to be in there. The loser, they're going to have a lot of pressure the rest of the season to get to that conference championship game. But I think these are 2 playoff contenders, 2 top 10, 12 teams for sure. And it's going to be a big one early in the season. But the biggest game, it's the game, Week 13, rivalry weekend, November 25th, Ohio State at Michigan. I think this is clearly the biggest game of the entire season, conference, non-conference, however you want to look at it, because I think there's a really good chance that these 2 teams are undefeated at the end of the season, or maybe they have one loss, but they're definitely going to be right there at the top of college football. So obviously this is a game that will more than likely decide who goes to the Big Ten Championship, unless Penn State gets into that conversation, which they could. And it's also, there are playoff implications here. If these teams come in with potentially a loss, then you can't lose this game. You're not going to make the college football playoff. If they're both undefeated, they're probably both going to be in. But it's still a huge game in terms of getting to the Big Ten Championship, getting the highest seed potentially in the playoff. So you're talking about 2 of the best teams in college football now. For the last few years, this game has been No, well, it's been a big game. It hasn't necessarily been. We haven't seen the closest, craziest finishes the last couple of years. Michigan has really surprised, I think, everyone, and maybe they do that again. But I do think this is the biggest game. Ohio State, Michigan, final weekend of the regular season, November 25th. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? Give me your thoughts on the 10 biggest conference games this upcoming season.